On the coast of Florida stands a palace that looks like a fairy tale, made of gold and marble. Beautiful, yes, but this house was never just a beautiful villa. Mar-a-Lago, sea to lake. 128 rooms, stretching from the Atlantic to the intracoastal waterway. At first, it was the dream of one woman, Marjorie Merriweather Post, who built it as her eternal throne, a banquet hall where crystal chandeliers shone while the country collapsed into the Great Depression. Then it became a private club. Then it became the Winter White House. And now it sits at the center of federal investigations, political fury, and questions that shake the foundations of American democracy. How did one golden palace transform from a serial heiress's fantasy into a stage for classified document scandals and potential espionage? What secrets are still hidden behind those heavy doors? Secrets that involve not just one owner, but two, and the invisible army of workers who built the dream? And here is the question that defines everything. Can a house built to prove one woman's worth survive becoming a symbol that half the country wants to see demolished? If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture and the families who built it, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which house to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. This is the story of the woman who had everything except belonging, and the man who turned her palace into a fortress. The building rises from the Florida shoreline like something transported from another century, another continent entirely. 128 rooms, 58 bedrooms, 33 bathrooms, gold leaf ceilings that catch the morning sun, marble floors shipped across an ocean, 17 acres of what was meant to be paradise. But before it became a private club, before it housed a president, before the protests and the headlines and the federal investigations, it was one woman's answer to a question she could never quite escape. How do you buy your way into a world that does not want you? Let us begin with Marjorie Merriweather Post. Born in Springfield, Illinois in 1887. Her father, C.W. Post, built the Postum Cereal Company from almost nothing. When he died by suicide in 1914, Marjorie was 27 years old. Overnight, she became one of the wealthiest women in America. The exact figure shifted with the markets, but by the early 1920s, her fortune was estimated at approximately $40 million, the equivalent of well over $1 billion today. Through aggressive acquisition, she transformed Postum into General Foods, a corporation that controlled everything from Jell-O to Maxwell House coffee. Her business acumen was formidable. Her wealth was staggering. Money bought her multiple estates: Hillwood in Washington, D.C., Camp Topridge in the Adirondacks, a yacht, the Sea Cloud, that had been a Coast Guard vessel before she purchased and transformed it into a floating palace with 83 crew members. Money bought her art collections that would eventually fill museums: Fabergé eggs, French furniture, Russian imperial treasures acquired after the Revolution, when desperate aristocrats sold their heritage for survival. Money even helped her find 4 husbands: Edward Close, a wealthy man who gave her daughters; E.F. Hutton, the Wall Street financier; Joseph Davies, the ambassador to the Soviet Union; Herbert May, a Pittsburgh businessman. Yet money could not keep any of them. And money could not buy her the one thing she wanted most: unquestioned acceptance into America's oldest, most exclusive social circles. The problem was simple, and for her almost impossible to solve. Marjorie was new money. Her fortune came from cereal, from breakfast food sold in boxes to ordinary Americans. This was not railroad money, not banking money, not the kind of wealth built slowly over generations by families whose names appeared in history books. The Astors looked down on her. The Vanderbilts were polite but distant. At Newport, at the most prestigious gatherings, Marjorie always felt an invisible wall. She received invitations, of course. She was far too rich to be shut out completely. But she was never entirely inside. The rejection stung. Marjorie had impeccable taste. She spoke French fluently. She collected Russian imperial art with scholarly precision. She entertained lavishly, with menus designed by French chefs and orchestras imported from New York. She was generous, cultured, educated. None of it seemed to matter. Old society had its rules. And one of them went like this. Serial money was not serious money. Stand in that social landscape for a moment. Imagine possessing more wealth than you could spend in 10 lifetimes, yet watching doors close because your father made his fortune too recently, in too common an enterprise. Imagine being treated as perpetually provisional, always the guest, but never the host who truly matters. To understand Marjorie's decision to build Mar-a-Lago, you have to understand that wound. The mansion was not simply a winter home. It was a statement, an argument made in marble and gold. You may not accept me, but you will never be able to ignore this. The location itself was a calculated choice. Palm Beach in the 1920s was already becoming the winter playground of wealthy Northerners. Henry Flagler had built the Royal Poinciana Hotel, and the breakers, the climate was perfect. The coastline was spectacular. But the grand houses that lined the island, the Stotesbury Estate, Addison Misner's Mediterranean fantasies, mostly belonged to the very families who made Marjorie feel like an outsider. So she decided she would build something bigger, something more breathtaking, something that made their mansions look almost modest by comparison. The decision to commission Mar-a-Lago was made sometime in 1924. Marjorie purchased the land, a narrow strip of the Palm Beach Barrier Island, for approximately $1.5 million, roughly $25 million today. The property was unique. It stretched from the Atlantic Ocean on the east to Lake Worth on the west, hence the Spanish name, Mar-a-Lago, sea to lake. She hired architects Marion Sims Wyeth, a Palm Beach specialist who had designed estates for the Woolworth family, and Joseph Urban, a Viennese theatrical designer whose work combined European grandeur with American confidence. Her instructions were precise and bold. She wanted a Spanish Moorish palace that nodded to the great estates of Europe while being distinctly, undeniably American in its scale and ambition. She wanted imported tiles from the 1926 Sesquicentennial Exposition. She wanted gold leaf on the ceilings. She wanted a tower visible from the ocean. She wanted gardens that rivaled anything in Newport. She wanted, in short, to build something that no one could dismiss. Construction began in 1925. The work would take 4 years, and it would cost far more than money. Between 1925 and 1929, Mar-a-Lago rose slowly from the sandy ground of Palm Beach. The construction was not simply building a house. It was importing an entire imagined world, piece by piece, across oceans and continents. Marjorie's architects worked from her vision, but that vision demanded materials Florida did not have. The project called for 36,000 antique Spanish tiles, bought from estates and demolished buildings across Spain. Each tile had to be cataloged, crated, and shipped across the Atlantic. Dorian stone for decorative elements came from quarries in Italy that had supplied Renaissance palaces. Carved wooden ceilings were commissioned from craftsmen in Venice who had trained in traditions passed down through generations. The main living room ceiling measured 75 feet long and was hand-painted by Italian artisans, then disassembled, packed in custom crates lined with straw, and shipped to Florida where it was reassembled like a three-dimensional puzzle. One miscalculation, one broken panel, and months of work would be lost. The dining room featured a 15th century Flemish tapestry that Marjorie purchased from a European estate sale. The guest bedrooms contained furniture that once belonged to European nobility, beds that had served dukes, desks where countesses had written letters, mirrors that had reflected faces now centuries dead, Every bathroom was a work of art. Hand-painted tiles depicted different themes. Seashells in one, tropical birds in another, geometric Moorish patterns in a third. No two bathrooms were alike. Each was a statement of individuality within the larger statement of the house itself. The scale was extraordinary even by Gilded Age standards. The main house covered approximately 62,500 square feet. To put that in perspective, the average American home in the 1920s was roughly 1,200 square feet. Mar-a-Lago was more than 50 times larger. The tower, inspired by the Torre del Oro in Seville, rose 75 feet into the Florida sky. From its top, you could see miles of coastline in both directions. The tower was not merely decorative, it was a declaration. A lighthouse announcing, "Here stands something that demands attention." There were 75 rooms in the original design, later expanded to 128, 33 bathrooms, 58 bedrooms, though Marjorie herself used only one. The ballroom could hold more than 200 guests and featured a ceiling painted with gold leaf that caught the light from enormous crystal chandeliers, each weighing hundreds of pounds and requiring special reinforcement in the ceiling joists. The loggia, an open-air corridor stretching along the oceanside, was paved with imported Dorian stone and decorated with Spanish tiles arranged in geometric patterns that seemed to shift and flow as you walked past them. The effect was hypnotic, almost dizzying in bright sunlight. Gardens surrounded the house on all sides. Formal rose gardens with varieties imported from England and France. Palm groves, citrus trees, a 9-hole golf course that required constant maintenance in Florida's climate, reflecting pools, fountains that ran continuously, creating a soundscape of moving water meant to evoke Mediterranean estates. Every detail reflected Marjorie's precise idea of grandeur. But grandeur requires infrastructure, and infrastructure requires labor. Step past the showpiece rooms, and the other face appears. Behind the beauty lies machinery. The mansion required an army to function. Kitchens sprawled underground, accessible through service entrances hidden from guest view. The main kitchen alone occupied more than 3,000 square feet. Industrial-scale refrigeration rooms, each the size of a small bedroom, stored food for elaborate dinners. Walk-in freezers held ice sculptures and specialty desserts. Pantries stocked enough provisions to feed 200 people at a moment's notice. The wine cellar held thousands of bottles, organized by region and vintage, maintained at precise temperature and humidity levels. A full-time sommelier managed the collection, advised on pairings, and ensured that no bottle ever reached a guest table past its prime. Laundries operated in basement rooms with enormous commercial washing machines, industrial dryers, and pressing stations where staff worked 12-hour shifts during the season. The volume of linens was staggering. Bed sheets changed daily, tablecloths changed after every meal. Towels replaced twice daily in guest bathrooms. During a busy week, the laundry processed thousands of individual pieces. Mechanical rooms housed the boilers and pumps that made the dream livable. Air conditioning in the 1920s was a luxury almost unheard of, especially in Florida's humidity and heat. The system Mar-a-Lago employed was cutting edge for its time, requiring massive compressors that ran constantly. During the summer months, fed by electrical generators that consumed enormous amounts of fuel. Miles of copper piping threaded through walls and ceilings, carrying chilled water to cooling coils in each room. The system required constant monitoring. Pressure had to be maintained, filters had to be cleaned, leaks had to be found and repaired immediately, because one failure could shut down the entire system and render the house uninhabitable. During the brutal summer months when temperatures regularly exceeded 95 degrees, the electrical system was equally complex. Mar-a-Lago had its own power plant with backup generators capable of running the entire estate, independently of the Palm Beach grid. This was essential. Power outages were common in 1920s Florida, and Marjorie could not tolerate the embarrassment of a dinner party interrupted by darkness. The plumbing system drew water from multiple sources. Wells on the property provided fresh water, supplemented by the municipal supply. Wastewater required its own infrastructure, septic systems capable of handling the output of what was essentially a small hotel. The staff quarters formed a separate, closed world of their own. Dozens of workers lived on site during the season, housed in buildings separate from the main house. Cooks, maids, groundskeepers, mechanics, drivers, personal secretaries, social coordinators. During peak months, the estate employed between 50 and 60 people at minimum, all of them necessary to maintain the illusion of effortless elegance. The hierarchy was rigid. At the top, the head butler, who managed the household staff and reported directly to Marjorie. Below him, specialized roles: the chef, the head housekeeper, the head gardener, the chauffeur. Below them, assistants and general staff who did the hardest, least visible work. Staff quarters were Spartan, small rooms with narrow beds, shared bathrooms, minimal privacy. The contrast with the opulence of the main house was stark. Workers who spent their days polishing silver and arranging flowers in crystal vases returned at night to spaces that resembled barracks more than homes. This parallel world was designed to remain out of sight. Service staircases, narrow and unadorned, allowed workers to move through the house without crossing paths with guests. These staircases were hidden behind panels and doors that blended seamlessly with the walls. A guest could spend an entire weekend at Mar-a-Lago and never see a single servant, even though dozens were constantly working just feet away. Kitchen entrances faced away from the formal gardens, tucked behind hedges and walls. Delivery trucks arrived at loading docks concealed from view. Garbage was removed through passages that guests never walked. Marjorie wanted perfection, but she wanted it to appear weightless, almost magical. Never the result of hard, visible labor. The effect required extraordinary coordination and an unspoken agreement among the staff. You exist to serve the illusion, and the moment you become visible, the illusion fails. But the building of Mar-a-Lago, before there were servants to hide, before there were guests to deceive, relied on hundreds more people, and their story is far darker. Local laborers, many of them Black and Hispanic men working for wages that barely covered basic needs, did the heaviest work. They dug foundations in sand and coral rock, breaking through with picks and shovels in heat that could kill. They hauled stone and timber, materials weighing hundreds of pounds, moving them from trucks to building sites with nothing but raw muscle and determination. They mixed concrete in enormous batches, pouring it into forms that would become the foundations, the walls, the floors. They laid drainage systems to prevent flooding on a barrier island, where tropical storms could arrive with little warning and dump feet of rain in hours. Florida summers were brutal. Temperatures above 95 degrees, humidity near 100%. The air felt thick enough to choke on. Men collapsed regularly from heat exhaustion. Medical care was minimal: a tent with cots, a bucket of water, aspirin for those who could keep it down. Work paused only during the most violent storms. Otherwise, the schedule was relentless. 6 days a week, 10-hour days, sometimes 12, Sundays off, but many workers used that day to take on additional jobs because the wages from Mar-a-Lago were not enough to support their families. Skilled craftsmen came from Europe and from the northern United States. Italian stonemasons who knew how to work with marble, who understood how different stones behaved under stress, who could carve decorative elements that looked effortless but required extraordinary precision. Spanish tile setters who understood the intricate patterns Marjorie demanded, who could visualize how thousands of individual pieces would fit together to create a coherent design. Carpenters who could install the hand-carved ceilings without damaging them, working from scaffolding in cramped spaces, every movement deliberate because one mistake could destroy months of someone else's work. Electricians threading miles of wiring through walls that were already going up, plumbers installing systems that had to function perfectly because there would be no second chances once the walls were sealed. The exact number varies in different accounts, but payroll records suggest the workforce peaked at more than 200 people during the most intense construction phases. For comparison, the Empire State Building, under construction at roughly the same time, employed about 3,000 workers at its peak. Mar-a-Lago was not as tall, but its complexity, the imported materials, the custom work, the precision required, demanded far more labor than a typical building of its size. The conditions were punishing. Sandstone dust hung in the air, coating lungs, causing respiratory problems that would plague workers for years after the job ended. The delicate installation of imported tiles demanded precision under pressure, because every delay meant cost overruns that Marjorie's managers refused to accept. Deadlines were enforced with threats. Miss a target, and you were replaced. Injuries were reportedly common. Falls from scaffolding onto concrete or stone resulting in broken bones, shattered spines, deaths. Cuts from stone and glass, some minor, others severing tendons and ending careers. Cases of heat exhaustion that sent men to makeshift medical tents, where they were given water and aspirin and sent back to work as soon as they could stand. The workers built something magnificent, and their names, with only a few exceptions, have disappeared from the record. One name survives in fragmentary accounts: Antonio Gomez, a Cuban immigrant 32 years old, working as a general laborer. He had come to Florida 5 years earlier, sending money back to his family in Havana. In August 1927, according to a brief mention in the Palm Beach Post, he collapsed while hauling materials in the afternoon heat. The temperature that day reached 98 degrees with 80% humidity. He was taken to a local hospital. He died 3 days later. The cause of death listed on the death certificate was heat stroke and cardiac arrest. No family is mentioned in the records. His burial location is unknown. There is no gravestone, no memorial, just a single line in a newspaper archive and a name on a payroll ledger that has since been lost or destroyed. How many others died? How many were injured and sent home to recover without compensation? How many developed long-term health problems from the dust, the heat, the relentless physical strain? The records do not say, and no one at the time thought to ask. The cost of building Mar-a-Lago was staggering. Estimates differ depending on which expenses are included, but most historians place the construction bill between $7 and $10 million. In today's currency, accounting for inflation, that equals approximately $150 to $210 million. And that figure covered only the building itself, not the furnishings that Marjorie would add over the following years, not the art she would install, paintings, sculptures, tapestries worth millions more, not the constant maintenance that would swallow additional millions over the following decades. The economics were absurd by any rational standard. Marjorie was spending the equivalent of what hundreds of working families would earn in their entire lifetimes to build a house she would occupy for only a few months each year. Timing made everything even more striking. Mar-a-Lago was completed in early 1929. By October of that year, the stock market crashed. The Great Depression began. Banks failed. Fortunes evaporated overnight. Unemployment soared. While Marjorie entertained in her ballroom, crystal chandeliers blazing, champagne flowing despite prohibition, orchestras playing Cole Porter and George Gershwin, bread lines formed in American cities. While her staff served elaborate dinners on gold-trimmed china, families elsewhere struggled to afford basic meals. While she installed a 9-hole golf course and stocked her wine cellar, unemployment reached 25% nationwide. 1 in 4 Americans could not find work. The contrast was brutal. impossible to ignore. Though many in Palm Beach society tried their best, newspapers occasionally mentioned the disparity, though carefully. Society columnists described Mar-a-Lago's parties in glowing terms while noting, in passing, the unfortunate economic conditions affecting less fortunate citizens. The tone was always sympathetic but distant, as if poverty were a natural disaster occurring somewhere else, unconnected to the world of wealth and privilege. Marjorie herself apparently never saw this contradiction as a moral problem. She believed sincerely that her fortune created jobs, that her spending kept money moving through the economy, that her patronage of artists and craftsmen served a wider good. She donated generously to charities. She supported museums and cultural institutions. She saw herself as a steward of wealth, using her resources to preserve beauty and create opportunities. Whether the men cutting stone in the Florida sun agreed with that view is something history does not record. Their voices are absent from the archives. Their perspectives were never solicited. They built the palace, and then they disappeared into obscurity. The mansion opened for its first full season in early 1930. Marjorie welcomed friends, business partners, minor European nobility, and anyone whose presence might raise her social standing. The parties quickly became legendary. Orchestras played in the ballroom. The guest lists mixed names from Hollywood, Washington, and Wall Street, Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford, senators and congressmen, industrialists whose companies controlled vast sectors of the American economy. Guests arrived by yacht, their vessels anchoring in Lake Worth, or by private rail car to the Palm Beach station, where they were met by Marjorie's fleet of cars, Rolls-Royces, and Pierce Arrows, driven by uniformed chauffeurs. The dinners were theatrical productions. The dining table seated 40 guests beneath the hand-painted Venetian ceiling. 7 courses, sometimes 9. Each course paired with a different wine, carefully selected by the sommelier. Crystal glasses that caught the candlelight and sent rainbow refractions dancing across the walls. After dinner, guests moved to the ballroom or the living room. Sometimes there was dancing. Sometimes card games, bridge, poker, games where fortunes changed hands with the turn of a card. Always there was the feeling of being somewhere important, somewhere that mattered. But the question that had driven the entire project still hung in the air, unspoken but persistent. Had she finally created something grand enough to erase the invisible line between herself and the old families who, even now, quietly saw her as an outsider? The answer would reveal itself slowly over years, and it would not be the answer Marjorie wanted to hear. The seasons at Mar-a-Lago followed a rhythm as precise as clockwork. Every November, Marjorie arrived from one of her other estates, Hillwood in Washington, D.C., where she maintained a permanent residence, or Camp Topridge in the Adirondacks, where she spent summers. The journey south was a production in itself. Trunks packed with clothing for every conceivable social occasion, jewelry cases containing pieces worth millions, personal items that could not be left behind or sent ahead with the staff. For weeks before her arrival, Mar-a-Lago had been preparing. The full-time caretaker staff, which maintained the estate year-round, was joined by seasonal workers hired specifically for the winter months. Every surface was polished, every room was aired and scrubbed. Fresh flowers were arranged in the entrance hall, roses, orchids, exotic blooms shipped from nurseries in Miami and beyond. The kitchen was stocked with provisions for months of entertaining. The wine cellar inventory was checked and replenished. The linens were inspected for any sign of wear or damage. The china, crystal, and silver were counted piece by piece to ensure nothing had been broken or stolen during the off-season. By the time Marjorie's car passed through the gates, the mansion seemed to have been waiting, unchanged and perfect, for her return. The illusion of timelessness, of a place that existed outside the ordinary flow of events, was complete. the winter season began. The guest lists were crafted with extraordinary care. Each dinner party, each weekend gathering, was designed to accomplish specific social goals. Diplomats and their wives, because Marjorie's third husband, Joseph Davies, was ambassador to the Soviet Union from 1936 to 1938 and later to Belgium. Through him, Marjorie gained access to diplomatic circles that might otherwise have remained closed. Business titans whose fortunes rivaled or exceeded Marjorie's own. The DuPonts, who controlled the chemical industry. The Mellons, whose banking empire financed much of American industry. Representatives from Standard Oil and U.S. Steel, companies whose reach extended across continents. Actors and actresses whose names in the papers added a layer of glamour and modernity. Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford, Hollywood royalty. Later, in the 1950s and 1960s, stars like Frank Sinatra and Elizabeth Taylor, whose presence guaranteed that Mar-a-Lago would be mentioned in gossip columns from New York to Los Angeles, and when she could get them, genuine European aristocrats. This was what Marjorie valued most: counts and countesses whose titles were real, whose family trees stretched back centuries, whose presence represented the validation she had sought her entire adult life. She pursued them relentlessly. She traveled to Europe, attending the right parties, making the right connections. She purchased Russian imperial treasures directly from exiled nobles who needed cash more than they needed family heirlooms. She offered her yacht for their use. She hosted them at her estates, always hoping that proximity would translate into acceptance. Sometimes it worked, at least superficially. European nobility in the early 20th century was often broke, living on prestige and fading glory. American wealth was useful. They accepted Marjorie's invitations, enjoyed her hospitality, wrote polite thank you notes. But there remained always a subtle distance. They were guests at her table. She was never quite a guest at theirs. The dinners at Mar-a-Lago were productions, not just meals. 30 or 40 guests seated in the formal dining room, the table stretching beneath the hand-painted Venetian ceiling that glowed with gold leaf in the candlelight. Each place setting consisted of multiple plates, multiple glasses, multiple pieces of silverware arranged according to strict protocols that everyone at the table was expected to understand instinctively. 7 courses, sometimes more. First, oysters or caviar, served on ice, accompanied by champagne. Then soup, consommé or bisque, clear and perfect, no imperfections. Then fish, often Dover sole or lobster, prepared by the French chef Marjorie employed at extraordinary expense. Then a palate cleanser, perhaps sorbet infused with mint or lemon. Then the main course, which might be roasted pheasant, beef Wellington, or lamb chops, accompanied by vegetables carved into elaborate shapes and arranged like still-life paintings on the plates. Then salad, because European tradition placed salad after the main course, not before. Then cheese and fruit. Finally, dessert, elaborate creations of spun sugar, chocolate, and cream that were almost too beautiful to eat. Wine pairings accompanied every course, carefully selected by the sommelier from Marjorie's extensive cellars. Champagne with the oysters, white Burgundy with the fish, Bordeaux with the meat, port with the cheese. Each bottle was chosen not just for flavor, but for the prestige of its label, the impressiveness of its vintage. Crystal glasses caught the candlelight and sent rainbow refractions dancing across the walls and ceiling. The effect was magical, deliberate, designed to make guests feel they had entered a world where ordinary concerns did not exist. Conversation moved carefully through safe topics: travel, who had been where, what they had seen, recommendations for hotels and restaurants, art, exhibitions in Paris, acquisitions by major museums, debates about modern movements versus classical traditions, society gossip, who was marrying whom, who had been seen where, scandals carefully discussed with just enough detail to be interesting but not so much as to seem vulgar. Politics was largely avoided or discussed only in the most general, abstract terms. Controversial subjects, labor strikes, racial tensions, the rise of fascism in Europe were sidestepped with practiced ease. The goal was pleasant conversation, not genuine engagement with difficult realities. After dinner, guests drifted to the ballroom or the living room or, on warm evenings, to the loggia, where they could walk along the open corridor and feel the ocean breeze. Sometimes there was dancing, with an orchestra playing popular standards and waltzes. Sometimes card games, where the stakes could be substantial, but were always handled with gentlemanly discretion. Sometimes simply conversation, the kind of meandering talk that wealthy people engage in when they have no pressing concerns and all the time in the world. Always there was the feeling of being somewhere important, somewhere exclusive, somewhere that signaled you mattered in ways that ordinary people did not. But beneath this choreography, invisible to the guests, ran the machinery that made it all possible. While guests dined upstairs, the kitchens below operated with near military precision. The head chef, always French because Marjorie believed only French chefs understood true cuisine, commanded teams of sous chefs, prep cooks, and kitchen assistants. Each had specific responsibilities. One station handled sauces, another handled vegetables, another handled desserts. Dishes moved from prep tables to stoves to serving trays in tightly timed sequences, choreographed down to the minute. One course finished, plates cleared by waiters who moved through the dining room in synchronized patterns, the next course already waiting in the warming ovens, ready to be plated and served. The heat was relentless, gas ranges blazing at full power, ovens at temperatures that turned the kitchen into a furnace, steam rising from pots of stock and reduction sauces, the air thick with heat and smoke, and the smells of cooking, butter, herbs, roasted meat, caramelizing sugar. Kitchen staff worked 12-hour shifts during major events, sometimes longer. They arrived in the early afternoon to begin prep work and did not leave until after midnight, when the last dishes had been washed and put away, when the kitchen had been scrubbed and prepared for the next day's work. The pay was modest, $30 to $40 per week for most kitchen staff, the equivalent of about $600 to $800 today. The head chef earned more, perhaps $75 per week, but even that was barely middle-class income. The labor was heavy and often dangerous. Burns from hot pans and scalding water were routine. Cuts from sharp knives were common. The pressure was constant. A sauce that broke, a soufflé that collapsed, a dish that arrived at the table even slightly imperfect, these were failures that would be noticed and remembered. The schedule did not slow. During the height of the season, from December through March, there were events almost every night. Dinners for 40, luncheons for 60, weekend parties where 50 guests stayed at the estate, requiring 3 full meals per day, plus afternoon tea and late-night snacks for those who wanted them. In the laundry rooms, workers dealt with mountains of linens. Tablecloths had to be washed, starched, and ironed to perfection. One stain, one wrinkle, one frayed edge, and the entire piece was rejected and set aside for repair or replacement. During the season, the laundry operated nearly around the clock. Industrial washing machines ran continuously, consuming vast amounts of water and detergent. Dryers heated to temperatures that made the rooms unbearable. Pressing stations where workers stood for hours ironing tablecloths that measured 8 feet by 12 feet, requiring multiple passes to eliminate every crease. The workers were mostly women, many of them black, earning even less than the kitchen staff, $20 to $25 per week, working 6 days, sometimes 7 when the schedule demanded it. They stood for hours in heat and humidity, breathing air thick with steam and detergent fumes, their hands raw from constant immersion in hot water and harsh chemicals. Groundskeepers maintained the 9-hole golf course, the formal gardens, the lawns, that stretched toward both the ocean and the lake. They worked early mornings and late evenings, invisible to the guests who walked the paths and admired the roses, and played golf without ever thinking about the labor required to maintain the illusion of natural beauty. The golf course demanded constant attention. Florida's climate was hostile to the grass varieties required for proper putting greens. The turf had to be watered, fertilized, aerated, treated for pests and diseases. The greens had to be mowed daily, the fairways every other day. Sand traps had to be raked and maintained. The entire course had to look perfect at all times, because Marjorie's guests expected nothing less. The gardens were even more demanding. Roses required pruning, feeding, pest control. Tropical plants needed careful monitoring because too much rain could cause root rot, too little could wilt them. Hedges had to be trimmed into precise geometric shapes. Flower beds had to be replanted seasonally to ensure continuous blooms. The workers who did this labor were paid $20 to $30 per week. They started work at dawn, often before the sun rose, and finished in the evening after the guests had retired to their rooms. They worked in heat, in rain, in occasional cold snaps that could damage the tropical plantings and require emergency interventions to save them. This parallel world sustained the illusion. Marjorie wanted magic. What she got was the labor of dozens of people working themselves to exhaustion so that everything appeared weightless, effortless, perfect. The operating costs were astronomical. Contemporary financial records, preserved in archives, suggest that maintaining Mar-a-Lago during the winter season cost between $15,000 and $20,000 per month. In today's currency, that equals approximately $300,000 to $400,000 monthly. For context, the median American household income in 1930 was approximately $1,500 per year. The cost of running Mar-a-Lago for 1 month exceeded what an average working family earned in an entire decade. The cost for a full season, 5 months from November through March, equaled more than 50 years of median household income. Where did the money go? Salaries for 50 to 60 staff members consumed perhaps $5,000 monthly. Food and wine for the endless entertaining consumed another $5,000. Utilities, electricity, water, fuel for the heating system consumed another $3,000 to $4,000. Maintenance and repairs consumed the rest. Broken tiles replaced, leaking roofs patched, worn carpets replaced, mechanical systems serviced. The house was a machine that consumed wealth and converted it into prestige, or tried to. Because even at this scale, even with this level of effort and expense, the question remained. Had it worked? Had Marjorie finally achieved what she wanted? In some ways, yes. Mar-a-Lago was talked about constantly in society circles. Magazines published photographs. Architectural journals wrote articles analyzing the design. Society columnists mentioned Marjorie's parties, describing the guest lists, the menus, the decorations. European nobility accepted her invitations and wrote polite thank you notes. Diplomats visited. Politicians angled for invitations because being seen at Mar-a-Lago conferred a certain status. But the deepest circles of old money remained closed. The Astors did not visit. The oldest Vanderbilt lines sent regrets, citing scheduling conflicts that everyone understood to be polite refusals. Marjorie could command attention. She could not command respect from those whose respect she most wanted. She had built a palace. But a palace is not the same as acceptance. And deep down, in moments of honesty, Marjorie must have known this. The house she built to prove she belonged instead proved only that she could spend money on a scale few could match. That was impressive, but it was not the same as belonging. And here is where the story takes a darker turn. Because the house that could not grant Marjorie the social standing she craved would decades later be used by another outsider. An outsider who did not seek acceptance from old money, who instead wanted to humiliate it, dismantle it, prove that wealth and fame could destroy any institution, corrupt any tradition, reduce everything to transaction and spectacle. But before we reach that transformation, we must follow Marjorie to the end of her story. And that end is both sad and inevitable. Marjorie Merriweather Post lived until 1973. She was 86 years old. For nearly half a century, she returned to Mar-a-Lago every winter, maintaining the estate, the staff, the parties, the illusion. But even for someone with her wealth, even for someone who had built an empire from breakfast cereal, the burden grew heavier with every passing year. The first cracks appeared during World War II. In 1942, the federal government requisitioned the Sea Cloud, Marjorie's beloved yacht. The vessel was converted into a weather observation ship and patrol vessel, serving in the Atlantic Theater. Marjorie supported the war effort publicly, but privately, she was devastated. The yacht represented freedom, escape, a floating version of the luxury she had created on land. Rationing made elaborate entertaining difficult. Sugar, butter, meat, all the ingredients essential for the kind of dinners Marjorie hosted, were strictly controlled. She complied with the regulations, or at least appeared to, though persistent rumors suggested that her wealth and connections allowed her to obtain supplies that ordinary Americans could not. Many of Palm Beach's grand estates were shuttered during the war, as their owners focused on the war effort or diverted resources to war bonds and defense industries. Mar-a-Lago remained open, but the parties were quieter, the guest lists shorter, the atmosphere somber. The world was at war. Young men were dying on battlefields across Europe and the Pacific. The idea of wealthy Americans hosting lavish parties while soldiers fought and died seemed, to many, obscene. Marjorie felt the criticism. She donated generously to the Red Cross and other war-related charities. She opened Hillwood to host events raising money for war bonds. She purchased bonds herself in substantial amounts, but the criticism did not entirely subside. After the war ended in 1945, Marjorie resumed her winter seasons with renewed energy. She was 58 years old, wealthy, socially prominent, determined to prove that Mar-a-Lago's best years lay ahead. For a time, it seemed she was right. The late 1940s and 1950s were, in many ways, Mar-a-Lago's golden age. The war was over. The economy was booming. American confidence was at its peak. Marjorie entertained lavishly, hosting everyone from senators to Hollywood stars to European nobility still recovering from the devastation of war. But beneath the surface, the world was changing in ways that would make estates like Mar-a-Lago increasingly difficult to sustain. The post-war era brought new attitudes, the Gilded Age values that had shaped Marjorie's youth, the belief that great wealth carried social responsibility, that philanthropy and culture justified private fortunes, that the wealthy were natural leaders deserving of deference, were giving way to something else. The civil rights movement questioned the moral foundations of inherited privilege. Labor unions gained power, demanding better wages and working conditions for the people who did the invisible work that kept estates running. Income taxes rose sharply, especially on the highest earners. By the 1950s, the top marginal tax rate in the United States reached 91%. Even with deductions and clever accounting, maintaining multiple estates required wealth on a scale that few could sustain, and the costs of Mar-a-Lago kept climbing. Maintenance alone consumed tens of thousands of dollars annually. The roof, constantly battered by salt air and tropical storms, required frequent repairs. Sections of tile cracked and had to be replaced with custom reproductions that cost exponentially more than the originals, because the craftsmen who made them were dying out, taking their skills to the grave. The air conditioning systems, state-of-the-art in the 1920s, were now outdated and inefficient, constantly breaking down. Replacing them would require installing entirely new systems, threading new ductwork through walls that could not be easily opened without damaging the decorative elements that made the house valuable in the first place. The imported tiles, the hand-painted ceilings, the carved wooden doors, all of it required specialists to maintain, and specialists were expensive. A master craftsman who could repair a 15th century tapestry or restore gold leaf ceiling work commanded fees that exceeded what ordinary workers earned in a year. The gardens and golf course required constant attention and consumed water on an industrial scale. Florida water bills reflected usage, and Mar-a-Lago's usage was staggering. Tens of thousands of gallons daily during the dry season to keep the grass green and the plants alive. Staff salaries increased as labor laws changed and social expectations shifted. The old model, live-in servants willing to work for room, board, and modest wages, was disappearing. Workers now expected better pay, health benefits, reasonable hours, days off. Marjorie, to her credit, generally treated her employees well, paying slightly above market rates and providing health care through a private doctor she retained. But treating employees well was expensive. And the number of employees required to run Mar-a-Lago had not decreased. If anything, it had increased as the house aged and required more maintenance. By the 1960s, Marjorie was spending approximately $500,000 annually to maintain Mar-a-Lago. In today's currency, that equals roughly $5 million per year. And the estate generated no income. It was purely a cost, a magnificent, irreplaceable, financially unsustainable cost. Marjorie began to think seriously about the future. She was in her 70s. She had no children who wanted the property. Her daughters, Adelaide and Eleanor, had their own lives, their own estates, their own social circles. They visited Mar-a-Lago occasionally, but neither wanted to take on the burden of maintaining it after Marjorie died. The estate was too expensive for almost anyone to maintain as a private residence. Even multimillionaires balked at the operating costs. Marjorie knew that when she died, Mar-a-Lago would likely be sold, divided, possibly demolished. The thought devastated her. She had spent nearly half a century building and maintaining Mar-a-Lago. It represented her life's work, her attempt to create something permanent, something that would outlast her and prove that her wealth had been used for more than self-indulgence. So in 1972, 1 year before her death, Marjorie made an extraordinary decision. She offered Mar-a-Lago to the United States government as a winter retreat for presidents and visiting foreign dignitaries, a winter White House. The offer was not a simple gift. It came with conditions. The government would have to maintain the estate to Marjorie's standards. They would have to preserve the furnishings, the art, the architectural integrity. They would have to use it as she intended for official functions, diplomatic receptions, meetings of national importance. She believed this was the only way to ensure Mar-a-Lago's survival. If the government accepted, the house would become a national treasure, preserved forever, maintained by taxpayers, used by presidents. It was a generous offer. Mar-a-Lago and its contents were worth tens of millions of dollars. The government would acquire an extraordinary property at no cost beyond maintenance, but the government declined. The official reasons given were vague and bureaucratic. Security concerns. The estate was difficult to secure, too open, too accessible from multiple sides. Maintenance costs. The operating budget would require congressional appropriations that might be politically difficult to justify. Political optics. Critics might attack the government for maintaining a palace, while ordinary Americans struggled with inflation and economic uncertainty. But the real reason was simpler and more brutal. No one wanted it. The estate was too expensive to operate. It was too associated with a bygone era, with values and aesthetics that no longer resonated with modern America. It was too impractical for actual use, too many rooms, too spread out, too difficult to adapt to the security requirements of hosting a president in an era of heightened threats. And there was another unspoken reason. Mar-a-Lago was Marjorie's dream. It reflected her taste, her values, her desperate desire for acceptance. Those were not values that the 1970s United States government wanted to embrace or be associated with. The rejection devastated Marjorie. She had believed genuinely that her offer would be accepted. She had imagined presidents walking through her gardens, foreign dignitaries dining in her ballroom, Mar-a-Lago becoming a symbol of American prestige and continuity. Instead, she received a polite letter thanking her for her generosity and declining the offer. Marjorie Merriweather Post died on September 12, 1973. She was 86 years old. She died at Hillwood, her Washington estate, surrounded by her daughters and a few close friends. Her obituaries praised her business acumen, her philanthropy, her art collections. They mentioned Mar-a-Lago as one of several estates she had built and maintained, but the tone was elegiac, even slightly dismissive. The era of grand private estates was over. Marjorie was described implicitly as the last of a breed. Mar-a-Lago passed to the Marjorie Merriweather Post Foundation, established according to her will to preserve her estates and collections. The foundation inherited the property and the responsibility for maintaining it. They tried. For several years, they operated Mar-a-Lago as Marjorie had requested. They kept the staff on. They maintained the gardens. They opened the estate occasionally for tours and charity events. But the costs were overwhelming. Within 3 years, the foundation was losing more than $1 million annually on Mar-a-Lago alone. The endowment Marjorie had left was substantial, but it could not sustain losses at that rate indefinitely. The estate began to decay. Without full-time staff, the gardens grew wild. Weeds invaded the formal beds. The grass on the golf course turned brown. The roof leaked, allowing water to damage ceilings and walls. Salt water and humidity infiltrated the foundations, accelerating deterioration. Priceless furnishings deteriorated. Fabrics rotted. Wood warped. Metal corroded. The foundation explored options desperately. Could they turn it into a museum? The operating costs would still be enormous, and there was no guarantee that enough visitors would pay admission to cover even a fraction of expenses. Could they divide it into luxury condominiums? Local zoning laws made that difficult, and preservationists fought the idea. Could they find a single buyer willing to maintain it as a private residence? No one came forward with a serious offer that included a commitment to preservation. Demolition seemed increasingly likely. The land alone was worth millions. Developers eyed the property hungrily. 17 acres of oceanfront in Palm Beach. That was extraordinarily valuable. The house, magnificent though it was also an obstacle. Tearing it down and building something modern, something profitable, something that could be sold or developed into multiple luxury units, that made financial sense. For several years, Mar-a-Lago's fate hung in the balance. The foundation did not want to demolish it, but they could not afford to maintain it. Preservationists argued passionately for saving the estate, but they had no money to offer and no practical plan for making it financially viable. And then, in 1985, Donald Trump appeared. Donald John Trump was born in Queens, New York, in 1946. His father, Fred Trump, was a successful real estate developer who built middle-class apartment complexes in Brooklyn and Queens, housing for working families and returning World War II veterans. Fred Trump was wealthy by any normal standard, worth tens of millions of dollars by the 1970s. But he was not socially prominent. He was a builder, a businessman, a man who made money from providing housing, not from creating architectural statements or hosting society parties. Donald, the fourth of 5 children, watched his father and learned. But where Fred was content to remain in the outer boroughs, building practical housing for ordinary people, Donald wanted something grander. He wanted Manhattan. He wanted glamour. He wanted his name on buildings that would be seen, talked about, envied. By the early 1980s, Donald had taken over the family business and rebranded it. He moved into Manhattan, taking on high-profile projects. He renovated the Commodore Hotel, transforming it into the Grand Hyatt. He built Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue, a mixed-use building with luxury condominiums, high-end retail, and his own personal residence at the top. He cultivated a public persona carefully, the brash deal-maker, the man who could turn anything into gold, the celebrity developer whose name became synonymous with luxury, even when the actual luxury was debatable. He wrote books, or had them ghostwritten. The Art of the Deal became a bestseller, presenting Trump as a business genius, a master negotiator, a man who always won. The reality was more complex. Trump's businesses lurched from success to near bankruptcy, but the public persona was what mattered. By 1985, Trump was 39 years old. He was wealthy, though not as wealthy as he claimed. He was famous, but he wanted to be more famous. He owned properties in New York and New Jersey, but he wanted something iconic, something that would make people take notice, something that signaled arrival. Mar-a-Lago was on the market. The Post Foundation had given up. They needed a buyer, any buyer who could afford the property and promise to preserve it. Trump saw an opportunity. The estate and surrounding land were listed for between $20 and $25 million. Trump negotiated aggressively. He pointed out the deteriorating condition. He emphasized the operating costs. He leveraged the foundation's desperation. He purchased Mar-a-Lago for approximately $8 million initially, plus additional purchases of surrounding land that brought his total investment to about $10 million, a fraction of the estate's construction cost, a bargain by any measure. But Trump did not want a winter home in the traditional sense. He did not want to host small, intimate dinners for carefully curated guests. He wanted a stage, a platform, a place that would generate attention and eventually revenue. At first, Trump treated Mar-a-Lago as a private residence. He and his wife at the time, Ivana, a Czech model and businesswoman, spent winters there. They hosted parties. They invited celebrities, Michael Jackson, Muhammad Ali, business partners, politicians who were useful to know. The estate appeared in magazines again. But the narrative was different from Marjorie's era, not refined elegance, not understated taste, something brasher, louder, more nakedly about wealth as power and spectacle. Trump redecorated extensively, often in ways that horrified preservationists. He added gold-plated fixtures to bathrooms. He installed his own furniture, much of it modern and ornate in a style that clashed with the original Spanish-Moorish aesthetic. He added his personal touch, which often meant excess, more gold, more shine, more obvious displays of expense. The operating costs, however, remained crushing, even for Trump, who claimed to be worth billions, but whose actual net worth was far less. Maintaining Mar-a-Lago drained resources. The estate consumed hundreds of thousands of dollars annually in maintenance, staff, utilities. And by the early 1990s, Trump's financial empire was in serious trouble. His Atlantic City casinos were failing, hemorrhaging money, drowning in debt. His airline, Trump Shuttle, was losing money. His other properties were heavily leveraged. He was billions of dollars in debt to various banks and creditors. He needed Mar-a-Lago to generate income, not just consume it. In 1993, Trump applied to Palm Beach to convert Mar-a-Lago into a private club. The application was controversial from the start. The town of Palm Beach was deeply resistant. Residents worried about traffic, noise, the transformation of a residential area into something commercial. Old money families objected to the idea of their neighbor becoming a for-profit club. Trump fought back with a strategy that was, in retrospect, characteristic. He threatened to subdivide the property. He claimed he would divide the estate into small residential lots and build multiple houses, which was technically allowed under existing zoning. The threat of having many new neighbors, rather than one estate, made the idea of a private club seem preferable. He also did something more controversial. He pointed out that other Palm Beach clubs had discriminatory policies. The Everglades Club and the Bath and Tennis Club had historically restricted Jewish members and people of color. Trump publicly stated that his club would be open to everyone, Jews, black members, anyone who could afford the membership fee. The tactic was calculated. It put his opponents in an uncomfortable position. How could they object to a club that was explicitly non-discriminatory without revealing their own prejudices? In 1995, after prolonged negotiations and legal battles, Trump received approval to convert Mar-a-Lago into a private club. The transformation was systematic. Trump divided the estate into private areas, which he retained for his personal use, and club areas accessible to members. He added facilities: a spa with massage rooms, saunas, treatment spaces, additional dining rooms, a grand ballroom for weddings and events capable of hosting 500 people. He renovated the kitchens, expanding them to handle large-scale catering. He added parking for hundreds of cars. He hired staff, dozens of workers to operate the club, from maitre d' to valets to housekeepers. The membership structure was straightforward. An initiation fee, originally $100,000, later raised to $200,000, with annual dues of $14,000. These fees were astronomical, well beyond what most wealthy people would consider reasonable for a club membership. But the pitch was effective. Join Mar-a-Lago and you join Trump's world. You get access to the estate. You attend parties where Trump himself might be present. You network with other wealthy people. You get to tell friends and business associates that you are a member of Mar-a-Lago, which carries a certain cachet, at least in certain circles. The model worked. Wealthy retirees looking for winter social opportunities signed up. Business executives who wanted to be associated with Trump's brand joined. Social climbers who saw membership as a status symbol paid the fees. By the late 1990s, Mar-a-Lago had several hundred members. The club generated millions in revenue annually: membership fees, event fees, restaurant charges, spa services. The revenue was enough to cover the operating costs and generate profit. Trump had turned Marjorie's money-losing estate into a profitable business, but the transformation came with consequences that would echo for decades. Marjorie had built Mar-a-Lago as a private sanctuary, a place where beauty and exclusivity coexisted away from public view. The house was hers. The guests were selected carefully. Everything was controlled. Trump turned it into a commercial enterprise. The estate that once hosted ambassadors and European nobility now hosted anyone who could afford the membership fee. Weddings for strangers, corporate events, bar mitzvahs, birthday parties. The house became a venue, a backdrop for people who paid for the privilege of using it. The staff changed fundamentally. The old model, loyal, long-term employees who saw their work as service to a grand vision, gave way to hospitality workers on hourly wages, typical of any resort or country club. Turnover increased. Complaints about working conditions surfaced periodically. In 2007, a group of undocumented workers from Costa Rica who had been employed at Mar-a-Lago came forward with stories of low wages, no overtime pay, pressure to work extra hours without compensation. The Trump organization denied wrongdoing and settled the cases quietly, paying undisclosed amounts to make the problem go away. In 2019, the Miami Herald reported that Mar-a-Lago had hired undocumented workers for years, many of them brought to the United States by a recruiting network that promised them work. Some of these workers had been employed at the club for more than a decade, working as housekeepers, servers, maintenance staff. When their immigration status was exposed during Trump's presidency, they were quietly dismissed. The irony was brutal. Trump had campaigned for president on promises of strict immigration enforcement, building a wall on the Mexican border, cracking down on businesses that hired undocumented workers. Yet his own club had employed undocumented workers for years, benefiting from their labor while paying them wages below what documented workers would accept. The guest experience changed as well. Where Marjorie's parties had been intimate and curated, Trump's events were large and impersonal. The club hosted as many as 5 weddings per weekend during peak season. The ballroom that once held carefully orchestrated dinners for 40 now hosted receptions for 500, with buffets, DJ music, and photo booths. The estate became a business, and businesses prioritize profit over aesthetics, efficiency over elegance, volume over exclusivity. And then came November 8, 2016. Donald Trump won the presidential election, defeating Hillary Clinton in one of the most shocking political upsets in American history, and Mar-a-Lago became the Winter White House. Between January 2017 and January 2021, Mar-a-Lago transformed from a private club into something unprecedented in American history, a for-profit resort that simultaneously functioned as a presidential residence and center of government power. Trump spent approximately one-third of his presidency at Mar-a-Lago. He called it the Winter White House, a title that carried echoes of Marjorie's original dream to give the estate to the government as a presidential retreat. But where Marjorie had imagined the government maintaining the property at taxpayer expense, Trump did the opposite. He maintained ownership and profited while taxpayers funded his stays. He hosted foreign leaders at Mar-a-Lago. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in February 2017. Chinese President Xi Jinping in April 2017. The visits were presented as diplomatic triumphs, informal settings that would foster personal relationships between world leaders. But the arrangements raised immediate questions. When foreign leaders visited, their security details, staff, and delegations had to be housed and fed. Where? At Mar-a-Lago, naturally. Who paid? The governments involved, including the United States government, which meant taxpayers. Secret Service agents, military personnel, White House staff, all of them required accommodations when Trump visited Mar-a-Lago. The club charged them the standard rates, rooms that cost $500 to $1,000 per night during the season, meals at club restaurants, use of facilities. Estimates compiled by government watchdog organizations suggest that taxpayers spent somewhere between $10 and $15 million at Mar-a-Lago during Trump's presidency. The money went directly to Trump's business. He profited from his own presidency in ways that no previous president had, because no previous president had maintained ownership of a resort while in office. Critics called it a blatant conflict of interest, possibly a violation of the emoluments clause of the Constitution, which prohibits federal officials from accepting payments from foreign governments or profiting from their public positions. Legal challenges were filed. None succeeded during Trump's presidency, though the questions remain unresolved. But beyond the financial impropriety, there was something more troubling. Mar-a-Lago was a security nightmare. The estate was designed for openness, not protection. It sprawled across 17 acres with multiple buildings, long perimeters facing the ocean and the lake, extensive grounds with gardens and pathways. Securing it for presidential visits required extraordinary measures. The Secret Service installed checkpoints, surveillance systems, temporary barriers. They restricted access to certain areas of the property. They conducted background checks on club members and staff. They established no-fly zones over the estate and deployed patrol boats in the surrounding waters. But Mar-a-Lago remained fundamentally a club. Hundreds of people, members, their guests, staff, moved through the property during presidential visits. The Secret Service could not prevent members from accessing club facilities. That was, after all, what they had paid for. This created absurd and dangerous situations. In February 2017, Trump and Prime Minister Abe were dining on the Mar-a-Lago patio when news arrived of a North Korean missile test. The two leaders reviewed intelligence reports at their dinner table, in full view of club members and guests. Photographs taken by club members and posted on social media showed Trump and Abe surrounded by advisors, reading documents by the light of their cell phones, because the patio had inadequate lighting for reviewing classified materials. Other diners watched from nearby tables. One club member posted a photo with one of the military personnel carrying the nuclear football, the briefcase containing launch codes for nuclear weapons, identifying the officer by name on social media. The incident sparked outrage. Classified information discussed within earshot of civilians with no security clearance. Military personnel exposed to potential threats. National security apparatus operating in a public restaurant. Trump dismissed the concerns. He called Mar-a-Lago the Winter White House and insisted it was perfectly appropriate for conducting government business. He seemed genuinely unable to understand why mixing his private club with the presidency might be problematic. The membership fees doubled after the election. Trump raised the initiation fee from $100,000 to $200,000 in January 2017, shortly before his inauguration. The implicit message was clear. Join now, and you get access to a club where the President of the United States spends his weekends. New members flooded in. Wealthy individuals, many with business interests that could be affected by federal policy, paid the fees. Lobbyists joined. Foreign nationals with business connections to their home governments joined. The club became a pay-to-play operation where money bought proximity to power. And proximity to power at Mar-a-Lago meant something specific. Unlike the White House, where access is carefully controlled and logged, Mar-a-Lago was informal. Members could approach Trump on the patio, at the dinner buffet, on the golf course. They could introduce themselves, start conversations, pitch ideas, make requests. There were no official records of these interactions, no White House logs documenting who Trump spoke with. The conversations happened in a gray zone where personal socializing blurred into government business. Reports emerged of members leveraging their Mar-a-Lago access for personal benefit. One member, who operated a for-profit veterans charity, allegedly used his relationship with Trump to influence Veterans Affairs policy. Two other members, neither of whom held government positions, were given unofficial roles advising on VA operations. Another member, a Ukrainian businessman, paid Trump's personal attorney to arrange meetings. The attorney, Michael Cohen, later pleaded guilty to federal crimes, including campaign finance violations and lying to Congress. But during the Trump presidency, Cohen operated partly out of Mar-a-Lago, meeting clients, negotiating deals, all while maintaining his access to the president. The staff at Mar-a-Lago worked under extraordinary pressure during this period. They served meals to world leaders. They cleaned rooms where classified materials might be present. They moved through spaces under constant Secret Service surveillance, their every movement observed, their backgrounds investigated. The club also faced repeated health and safety violations. Palm Beach County health inspectors cited Mar-a-Lago multiple times between 2017 and 2020 for violations in the kitchen, improper food storage, inadequate sanitation, expired ingredients, improper temperature controls. Each violation resulted in fines, corrections, and follow-up inspections. The club always fixed the immediate problems. But the pattern raised questions about management and oversight. How could a club charging membership fees of $200,000 repeatedly fail basic health inspections? Labor issues persisted. In 2018, the Trump Organization applied for dozens of H-2B visas to bring in temporary foreign workers, servers, housekeepers, cooks. The applications claimed that qualified American workers could not be found. Yet unemployment in Palm Beach County was low, and hospitality workers were available. The real reason for preferring foreign temporary workers was simple. They were cheaper and more compliant. Temporary visa workers could not easily complain about working conditions or wages because complaining could result in losing their visa and being deported. Trump spent approximately 130 days at Mar-a-Lago during his presidency. Those visits cost taxpayers millions in security, transportation, and accommodations. And Trump's businesses profited from every visit. When Trump left office in January 2021, he moved to Mar-a-Lago permanently. He made it his legal residence, declaring Florida residency to take advantage of the state's favorable tax laws. He converted part of the estate into his post-presidential office, working from Mar-a-Lago, hosting meetings there, maintaining his political operation. But the mansion's role in history was not finished. In fact, the most damaging chapter was about to begin. On August 8, 2022, FBI agents executed a search warrant at Mar-a-Lago. They arrived in the morning, presented their warrant to Trump's attorneys, and spent hours searching the property. They were looking for classified documents that Trump had taken from the White House when he left office in January 2021. What they found was staggering and deeply disturbing. More than 300 classified documents, more than 100 of them marked with classification indicators: confidential, secret, top secret. Some documents were marked with special access programs, the highest level of classification, involving intelligence so sensitive that only a handful of people in the government are authorized to view them. Some documents related to nuclear weapons, America's nuclear arsenal, capabilities, vulnerabilities. Some related to intelligence operations, including human sources whose lives could be endangered if their identities were exposed. Some related to military plans, contingency operations, strategic assessments. The documents were stored haphazardly throughout Mar-a-Lago. Some were in Trump's personal office, some were in a storage room, some were in boxes stacked in a bathroom, visible in photos that later became evidence. The boxes mixed classified documents with personal items, newspaper clippings, magazine covers featuring Trump, personal correspondence, clothing. The storage room, where many of the classified documents were kept, had no special security. It was a converted closet with a simple lock. The door was not always locked. Surveillance footage obtained by investigators showed people moving boxes in and out of the room over many months. Staff members had access. Club members walked past the room regularly. Guests staying at Mar-a-Lago, foreign nationals among them, were housed in nearby rooms. The potential for unauthorized access to classified material was extraordinary. The implications were profound and terrifying. Classified information, potentially involving national security secrets of the highest order, had been stored in a private club where hundreds of people, members, guests, staff, foreign nationals, had potential access. For 18 months after Trump left office, this material sat at Mar-a-Lago while the club operated normally, hosting weddings, parties, meetings. The legal consequences began immediately. The Department of Justice opened a criminal investigation, federal. Prosecutors reviewed the materials recovered. They interviewed witnesses, Trump's attorneys, Mar-a-Lago staff members, anyone who might have knowledge of how the documents came to be there and who had access to them. Trump's response was characteristically defiant. He claimed the documents were his personal property, ignoring the fact that presidential records belong to the government under the Presidential Records Act. He insisted he had declassified the materials, though he offered no evidence that the required declassification process had been followed. He accused the FBI of planting evidence, of conducting an illegal raid, of political persecution. He rallied his supporters, who echoed his claims and defended him unconditionally. But the evidence was overwhelming. The documents were clearly marked classified. They had been stored insecurely. And despite repeated requests from the National Archives and eventually subpoenas from the Department of Justice, Trump had refused to return them. In June 2023, a federal grand jury indicted Trump on 37 criminal counts related to the classified documents. The charges included willful retention of national defense information, conspiracy to obstruct justice, withholding documents in federal proceedings, corruptly concealing documents in a federal investigation, scheming to conceal, and making false statements. The indictment was historic. No former president had ever been charged with federal crimes. The details laid out in the indictment painted a damning picture. Trump had not simply forgotten to return documents, he had actively resisted their return. When his attorneys asked where the classified materials were so they could be returned, Trump allegedly showed them some documents while concealing others. When a subpoena was issued demanding their return, Trump allegedly directed staff to move boxes to hide them from his own attorneys. One witness, a Mar-a-Lago staff member, testified that Trump told him to delete security camera footage that might show boxes being moved. The staff member refused and instead provided the footage to investigators. Another witness, Trump's personal aide, testified that he helped move boxes at Trump's direction, not knowing at the time that he was participating in obstruction of justice. The evidence included text messages, recorded conversations, security footage, and testimony from multiple witnesses who corroborated the government's case. Trump pleaded not guilty to all charges. His legal team argued that the prosecution was politically motivated, that Trump believed he had the authority to declassify the documents, that the Presidential Records Act gave him broad discretion over what materials to retain. Legal experts largely dismiss these arguments. The Presidential Records Act explicitly states that presidential records belong to the government. Declassification requires a process, not just a president's belief that materials are declassified. And even declassified documents can be subject to retention laws if they contain national defense information. The case is ongoing as of this telling, but the damage to Mar-a-Lago's reputation is permanent and profound. The estate that Marjorie Merriweather Post built to prove her worth, that she tried to gift to the nation as a symbol of American grandeur, is now synonymous with one of the most serious national security scandals in American history. Federal investigators have combed through its rooms, photographed its spaces, analyzed its security vulnerabilities. The storage room where classified documents were kept has been photographed extensively, measured, documented as evidence in a criminal case. Witnesses have testified about what they saw and heard. Staff members have been questioned under oath about Trump's instructions, about who had access to what areas, about what they knew and when they knew it. Mar-a-Lago is no longer just a mansion. It is a crime scene. It is evidence. It is a symbol of presidential misconduct, of national security negligence, of the corruption that results when a public office is treated as a private business opportunity. The club continues to operate. Members still pay their fees. Events are still hosted. Trump still lives there, conducting his post-presidential political operation, hosting meetings, giving interviews. But the shadow of the scandal cannot be escaped. Every event at Mar-a-Lago is now viewed through the lens of the classified documents case. Every photograph from the club is scrutinized for what might be visible in the background. Every staff member is a potential witness. And here is the cruelest irony, the final betrayal of Marjorie's dream. She wanted Mar-a-Lago to last forever. She wanted it to represent something enduring, something noble, something that elevated American culture and demonstrated that great wealth could be used for great purposes. She got her wish in the worst possible way. Mar-a-Lago will be remembered. It will be studied. It will appear in history books, but not for the reasons she imagined. It will be remembered as the place where a former president stored classified documents in a bathroom, as the place where national security secrets sat next to golf shoes and old magazine covers, as the place where the line between public office and private profit was erased so completely that the distinction became meaningless. Mar-a-Lago will be remembered, but as a cautionary tale, not a triumph. Stand at the gates of Mar-a-Lago today and you see a palace, gold leaf catching sunlight, Spanish tiles in geometric patterns, a tower rising into the Florida sky like something from a dream or a warning. Beautiful, yes, still beautiful, but beauty is never the whole story, and sometimes beauty becomes the disguise that hides something darker. Marjorie Merriweather Post built Mar-a-Lago to prove she belonged. She spent millions, $7 to $10 million in 1920s currency, the equivalent of 150 to 200 million today. She imported materials from across the world. She employed hundreds of workers whose names are now lost to history, except for a few like Antonio Gomez, who died building her dream. And she never got what she wanted. Old society never truly accepted her. The house could not change who she was in their eyes. She remained always the serial heiress. New money, not serious money. The house was magnificent, but magnificence is not the same as belonging. She tried to give Mar-a-Lago to the government, hoping it would become a winter White House, a place where presidents would vacation and conduct affairs of state, a symbol of American greatness preserved for future generations. The government said no. They did not want it. It was too expensive, too impractical, too much a symbol of a bygone era that America wanted to move past. Marjorie died heartbroken in 1973, knowing that her dream would not survive in the form she intended. And then, Donald Trump bought it. For $10 million. A bargain, a steal. He understood something Marjorie never fully grasped. Exclusivity could be monetized. Beauty could be turned into profit. A palace could be a stage, and stages generate revenue. He converted it into a private club. Anyone who could pay the fee could join. Anyone who could rent the ballroom could host their wedding there. The house that Marjorie built for herself became a business, and businesses prioritize profit above all else. When Trump became president, Mar-a-Lago became the winter White House, after all, but in a form that would have horrified Marjorie. Not maintained by taxpayers as a public trust, but owned by the president himself, who profited from his own visits, who charged the Secret Service and foreign delegations to stay at his club, who mixed government business with private enterprise so thoroughly that the line between them disappeared. And then came the classified documents, national security secrets stored in a bathroom. Intelligence about nuclear weapons kept in boxes next to old magazine covers. The most sensitive information in the United States government sitting in a storage room with a simple lock, in a club where hundreds of people moved freely. The workers who built Mar-a-Lago, Antonio Gomez, and the hundreds like him whose names we will never know are forgotten. Their labor created something that outlasted them, but their sacrifice bought them nothing. No recognition, no memorial, just a paycheck if they were lucky, and an early grave if they were not. The workers who maintain Mar-a-Lago today, housekeepers, cooks, groundskeepers, servers, are invisible. They move through the estate cleaning rooms where classified documents once sat, serving meals to club members who paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for proximity to power, maintaining the illusion of glamour while being paid wages that barely support their families. Many of them are undocumented immigrants brought to the United States by recruiting networks that promised work. They live in fear of deportation while working for a man who campaigned on deporting people exactly like them. The hypocrisy is crushing. But hypocrisy, we have learned, is abundant at Mar-a-Lago. What is the lesson? Perhaps this: beauty built on exclusion is fragile. Grandeur sustained by exploitation collapses eventually, if not physically, then morally. And houses, no matter how magnificent, cannot grant immortality or erase the compromises required to build them. Mar-a-Lago survives. The The building stands, the club operates, events are hosted. But what survives is a ghost, a shell, a symbol that has been corrupted beyond recognition. The dream Marjorie imagined, a place of elegance, refinement, acceptance, a sanctuary where beauty and culture elevated the human spirit, died long before she did. What remains is a commercial enterprise wrapped in legal controversy, a palace that became a fortress, a symbol that means different things to different people, none of them what Marjorie intended. To Trump's supporters, Mar-a-Lago represents success, aspiration, proof that wealth and fame can overcome any obstacle. To his critics, it represents corruption, the transformation of public office into private profit, the erosion of norms and values that once seemed inviolable. To historians, it will be remembered as a crime scene, the place where national security was compromised, where a president stored classified documents in a bathroom, where the line between personal interest and national interest was erased. To architectural historians, it remains a remarkable example of 1920s design, a Spanish Moorish palace that represents the ambitions and aesthetics of the Gilded Age. But even they acknowledge that the building's historical significance is now inseparable from the scandals associated with it. So here's the final question, the question that haunts Mar-a-Lago and everyone connected to it. What was it all for? Marjorie spent her fortune trying to buy belonging. She never got it. Trump bought the estate and turned it into a business, then a stage, then a symbol of everything wrong with American politics. The workers who built it and maintain it remain invisible, exploited, forgotten. And what do we have? A beautiful house, a contested legacy, a story that refuses to end cleanly because it cannot end cleanly. Perhaps that is the only honest conclusion. Mar-a-Lago is not a fairy tale. It never was. It is evidence of what humans will do for belonging, for power, for the illusion that beauty and wealth can make us immortal, can erase our limitations, can prove that we matter. The gates still stand. The tower still rises into the Florida sky. The ocean still crashes against the seawall, patient and relentless, waiting for the day when the house can no longer resist its advance. But the dream that built Mar-a-Lago is as lost as the workers who died constructing it, as lost as Marjorie's hope for acceptance, as lost as any belief that this house represents something noble rather than something cautionary, and no amount of gold leaf can bring it back. The beauty is real. The house is magnificent. But beneath the beauty, beneath the gold and marble and Spanish tiles, lies a truth that no amount of wealth can disguise. Some dreams cost more than money. They cost integrity. They cost lives. They cost the ability to see clearly what we have become in pursuit of what we think we want. Mar-a-Lago will survive, at least for now. Buildings are stubborn things. But survival is not the same as vindication. Standing is not the same as standing for something. The house remains, the dream is gone, and the workers who built both are forgotten. That is the real story of Mar-a-Lago. Not a fairy tale, a tragedy. One that continues unfolding. One that has not yet reached its final act.